Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you're at in the world here. Today, we're going to talk about a really important question that seems to be outdated in a lot of circles. And we're going to talk a little bit about whether people like Nietzsche, Piaget, Jung, whether they're actually relevant in today's world. Now, this is a really important question that I think a lot of people are not asking themselves today, especially in our modern political climate. I want to see how or if maybe we can actually apply their insights to today's world without being closed-minded, without shutting ourselves off about the limitations that these people had. This lecture today, I want to get into this because I think this is something that you and I need to discuss. We need to discuss it on a very deep level. If you've never heard of Nietzsche, if you've never heard of Jung, if you've never heard of Piaget, go back and read this. It's very basic philosophy, psychology, but very deep psychology and sociology and philosophy. And this is what is going to really open your eyes to something I think that we're dealing with in today's modern world. Because too often people like Piaget, too often people like Jung, people like Nietzsche, they're often dismissed in today's world as being outdated, maybe even too dangerous, maybe even overly negative individuals. Nietzsche is seen as being nihilistic, right? So if you're nihilistic, you're probably going to think Nietzsche, right? Jung is a little bit of a mystic, maybe. Piaget, he feels like he's kind of locked in developmental behavior textbooks these days. But there's more to it than this. If we step back and we look at this from the 30,000-foot view, these people like Nietzsche, specifically Nietzsche, Jung, Piaget, who we're going to talk about today, they actually give us some very powerful tools to understand where we're at as a society today in the Western world, especially politically leaning. It also gives us some insight into our social structures and the way that we kind of negotiate and navigate our lives together. So let's dig into this a little bit because this is a really important question. So I want to start with Nietzsche. He's often painted as a very dark philosopher, a very man of despair, right? Nietzsche is. But if we reframe this, let's reframe Nietzsche. Let's reframe who Nietzsche is. Nietzsche gives us a vocabulary that sets us up for really understanding our political movement of where we're at today. You'll see what I mean in just a second. A lot of the things that Nietzsche said was taken out of context, right? It was taken completely out of context. Famously quoted to say, God is dead. Well, what came after that? God is dead and we killed him. He did not say, and there's not enough water to wash the blood away. He didn't say that. That was attributed to him much later on. But he also didn't say that God is dead alone. He didn't say that. If you read The Gay Science, you'll understand exactly what he said and what he meant. And that's how we take things out of context. So we need to think about how Nietzsche gives us the vocabulary to understand the political movement. Nietzsche had a concept of the will to power. The will to power. And this is not just about domination. Not in the least. It's about the human drive for agency, creativity, for influence, for all sorts of things. I want you to think, when you think of Nietzsche, I want you to think of grassroots movement, like things like climate change, digital rights advocates, or or even these decentralized communities like Discord or Reddit, some of the ed tech stuff that's out there today. These things aren't just about policy. They're about exerting agency in the face of the institutions that people feel ignore them. Do you follow what I'm saying here? But then Nietzsche had a social distinction. This idea between slave and slave morality. Did you ever think of that? Nietzsche warned that societies often define themselves by resentment. Sound familiar? Does that sound familiar? It should. Societies define themselves by who is guilty, by who is powerful, by who is to blame. Our whole judicial system is kind of built off of Nietzsche, right? This should sound very familiar. It should sound really familiar to you, because our current political debates are often framed less around a shared vision and around unity and around what brings us together, and more about who is villainized. That's Nietzsche. Look at the last political debates that we had in America since about at least 2015. At least that long. It's about making the other person look like a villain. So I think instead of framing Nietzsche as a pessimist, I think we can see him in this modern application as a challenger. And 150, 200 years ago almost, right? He's challenging us, asking us, how do we create new rules? And how do we create new values? How do we replace these things when the old rules and the old values collapse? That feels very urgent in today's time frame, in today's world, where we trust institutions, the media, pastors, churches, authority figures. When we trust them so much and that truth starts to break down, Nietzsche comes into play. So now we're going to talk about Jung. Okay, we're going to talk about the psychology of politics here. Jung. Carl Jung, you can't have this conversation with talking about archetypes either, right? Okay, this is just part of it. You got to have this conversation. Because Jung's language of archetypes and the collective unconscious, it sounds very mystical, very strange. But if you think of it as a way of explaining stories that drive people, then Jung begins to make a lot more sense, right? I mean, he does. Every political figure that you deal with using this younger philosophy becomes more than just a politician, more than just a person. And I don't care whether it's your mayor or whether it's your congressman or whether it's your sheriff or your district attorney. Anyone who's elected or put into power becomes more than a person. They become a symbol. They become a symbol. The strong father figure, right? The trickster outsider. The savior or the redeemer who's going to bring us all back from the depths of hell and destruction. That's Jung. That's Jung. These archetypes explain why people follow leaders despite scandals like we're seeing today, despite contradictions, even failed policies. If we understand this, that every political figure becomes more than a person, things like what we see today, and a lot of you are going to say I'm just pulling out Trump or whatever, and I'm not. He's just a good figure of this. It pulls out these archetypes in our society. Populist movements are really great example of this too. Because the leader in a populist movement doesn't just make promises. They embody the archetype of the outsider hero. Drain the swamp. Or the voice of the forgotten. That's what these people do. So if we look at Carl Jung, Jung helps us realize that if we ignore the symbolic dimension of politics, we miss why facts and rational arguments so often fail. We miss that. Politics, I want you to understand, politics is not just about policy. Far from it. It's about myth. It's about meaning, and it's about belonging. That's what you have to understand. That's what politics is about. That's what the media is about. That's what universities are becoming, a lot of them. Not all of them, a lot of them. They're following into this Jung philosophy. Now, I'm going to throw a name out here that a lot of you probably don't know. A lot of you probably have never read Piaget. I've read Piaget a lot in my career and in my studies. And Piaget, if you study Piaget, you generally think of a behavior scientist, right? Kind of the father of behavioral mechanisms. And we know him as kind of like the backbone of developmental psychology. And he studied how children think, right? But Piaget's observations about games can give us a real fresh set of eyes on politics and where we're at today. Piaget noticed that children learn morality through play. That's an interesting concept. Children invent rules. Children argue about fairness or whatever. They renegotiate when someone disagrees with them, right? In other words, in a child's mind, the rules aren't fixed. They're socially constructed and they're constantly tested. Politics 101. Politics 101. You might be asking yourself, well, Matt, how do we apply this to politics? That's a good question. Because society, if you look at society, it's one giant game with overlapping rules, right? One group says that the rules are absolute free speech. Another group says that the rule of free speech is there, but it has boundaries. It has limitations. You can't harm someone with free speech, right? Both sides are playing the same game here, right? That game is democracy, mind you, okay? But they're arguing about what the rules mean. The Supreme Court, courts of law, whatever, right? Game theory in this sense is about negotiation. Do we play cooperatively or do we play competitively? Do we share? I thought I had a ball here. Do we share the ball or do we keep moving the goalpost? What do we do? Politics fails. Politics fails. It does. Listen to me when I say this. Politics fails when groups stop negotiating and they stop employing Piaget to the world of government and society. That's when politics fails. When they stop negotiating. When they stop trying to hash out the rules and they start refusing to play at all. That's when politics and good government fail. That's what a lot of you who are watching this and who are listening to this lecture don't understand. When we start refusing to play at all, when you stop negotiating, when you stop trying to employ these Piagetian philosophies of things, things break down. Things fail. There's a consequence. This is politics. This is where we're at today. And I'm not just describing Donald Trump. I'm not just describing the Democrats. I'm not just describing one side or the other. That's not what I'm here to do. I'm telling you how these people like Nietzsche, Jung, Piaget, how they've influenced our modern social and political behavior. It's very interesting. And Piaget teaches us that this is what happens when you stop negotiating and when the rules break down. This is what happens. Okay, so what happens when we put all of these things together? We take these building blocks and, we take Nietzsche, and we take Jung, and we take Piaget. We put all of this stuff together. What happens? That's a good question. Nietzsche reminds us power and value creation are inevitable. That's what we can take from Nietzsche. The question whether we create life-affirming decisions or destructive values. That's what Nietzsche brings to the table in 2025 Western world. What about Jung? Jung shows us that mythology, dreamers, people who live in La La Land, archetypes, they drive mass psychology in ways that facts alone just can't touch. So you end up with facts and alternative facts. What does Piaget give us? Anybody? You want to take a shot at this? Piaget gives us a model for how societies build, how things are constructed, how contests are played out, how elections are done, how we renegotiate the rules, how trade barriers become intertwined in all of this. Through our interactions. That's what Piaget does. Piaget gives us a model for how societies build and how things are constructed. If we want a healthier political climate, maybe the task is that we need to design better games, not better rules. We need to design games that respect people's need for power and agency, Nietzsche, okay? Give them shared stories and belonging, Jung. And we need to create fair, flexible rules that can evolve over time, Piaget. All right, so I'm going to leave you with this question as we kind of close this lecture out here today. I want to leave you this question. Without dismissing these three thinkers, these three thought thinkers, as being negative or mystical or outdated or naive, whatever, I want to suggest that we treat them as tools, not as dogmas, not as saints, and not as villains, right? I want us to see them through a lens that portrays our world very differently, very uniquely. And I want to leave you with this question. I want to leave you with this very serious question. What would it mean to design a society where creativity, where storytelling, and where fair play all work together? What would that mean? What would that society look like? That, I think, is the challenge that we face in our modern political climate where we're at today. I want you to think about that. What would it mean to design a society where creativity, storytelling, and fair play all work together for the greater good? That's the real question. So, all right, so I want you to take this and I want you to think about Jung. I want you to think about Nietzsche. I want you to think about Piaget. I want you to go back and read some of this and how some of their quotes and their sayings and their ideas might have been taken out of context. Maybe it's because a lot of us don't understand people like Piaget, for instance. I don't pretend to understand behavior, developmental behavior. But that's a whole different topic. But I understand how through observation, how societies work and how people work. So I want to go back to leaving you with this very, very, very simple question. that has a very complex answer. What would it mean to design a society where creativity, storytelling, and fair play all work together for the greater good? Thank you very much.